All right, everybody. So as you know, in the last year, I've been going pretty hard into CPU cooler reviews. During that time, I have found some really surprising gems. But the other thing that has been happening is that there's been a growing list of coolers that I might have either overlooked, you guys basically recommended in the comments of previous videos, or I just wanted to give a fair shake in our testing. So that is what this video is all about, taking a bunch of those coolers and adding them into this massive comparison that we're sort of building towards. And the other thing that you need to know is that the links to buy all of these coolers and the previous ones that we tested are in the description below. So let's not waste any more time. Let's talk about some of these that I've rounded up. Starting with maybe one of the most obscure coolers here, at least to me, is the triple fan Jonsbo HX7280. It's an all black design without any flashy bits or in-your-face logo, so you gotta appreciate that. There's also a total of 7 heat pipes that make their way down into a pretty well finished base. It's all just very stealth looking other than a subtle dimple texture on the fans. And speaking of those fans, there's 3 of them, which gives you a few options. If you're space constrained, you can run a single 140mm in the middle, or add the 120mm at the front if you have higher memory modules. Alternately, if you're using lower height memory, you can swap the 120mm for another 140mm. But if you want to go balls to the wall and have the additional horizontal space, you'd mount the 120mm at the front, 140mm in the middle, and another 140 for the exhaust. That's the combo we'll actually be testing in this video. Another little known cooler around here is the Montech DT24 that's available in both premium and base forms. Structurally, there's absolutely nothing different between the premium and the base models either. Both have dual towers along with the exact same fin stacks, 6 6mm heat pipes, and because of the 120mm fan format, memory clearance isn't a problem whatsoever. The biggest difference here is the top plate. Because the premium's extra $12 gets you a flat black CNC milled aluminum cover with a massive Montech logo and ARGB lighting. Then there's the ID Cooling SE207XT Black, which is another pretty compact dual tower 120mm design and is one of the lowest priced ones here if you can find it in North America. It's widely available for between $40 and $50 in a lot of other regions though. Next up, well, let's just call these the Thermalright twins. They are the FC140, which is right over here, and the FS140, which is a little bit further down there. Now, these are potentially some of the best kept secrets in the air cooling space right now. And there might not seem to be all that much physical difference between these two, right down to an identical size. Whereas the Peerless Assassin uses a dual 120mm setup, these step things up to a 120-140 combo. There's also a pretty big price gap since the Commander 140 is considered a higher end option while the Spirit is a little bit more budget focused. As a matter of fact, if you play your cards right, you can sometimes find the Spirit for the exact same price as the Peerless Assassin. But what are the actual differences? Well, it comes down to 3 things: fans, heat pipes, and fins. The Commander uses slightly faster fans that can push more air and feature a wider static pressure envelope than the Spirits, but also make a hell of a lot more noise. On the other side, the Commander also has 5 chonky 8mm heat pipes, whereas the Spirit has only 4. But it's the fin design that might have you scratching your head a little bit. If you look closely, the Spirits are placed a little bit closer together, and that leads to it having 58 fins versus the Commander's 52. And there's one cooler here that I absolutely had to include because everybody has been requesting this in the comment threads. It is supposed to be the benchmark upon which every other air cooler is measured, and that would be not the D15 because that's already in our charts. It is this guy. This is the IceGiant Prosiphon Elite, and it is actually one of the most expensive air coolers around, but it is also one of the most unique. That's because it uses a miniaturized version of a thermosiphon system instead of conventional heat pipes. Essentially, the heat generated by the CPU boils a contained liquid, which then rises as heated vapor and subsequently gets cooled off inside the condenser array. Once it's cooled off, it falls, and therein, the process is simply repeated. There are a few trade-offs, and those are primarily with the size of this thing. It's absolutely huge, and even though it's technically an air cooler at $165 US, the Elite runs firmly into 240mm and even 360mm AIO pricing territory. Either way, what you get is pretty straightforward. There's a simple, well-finished base plate that's linked via a pedestal to a massive condenser, which is cooled by 4 2300 RPM fans. Also, because of the unique engineering in its design, the Prosiphon can only be mounted horizontally in a standard ATX case. So it's sucking hot air from around the GPU area, and it also runs contrary to the airflow direction of most cases. The last cooler here is sorta an oldie but a goodie. This is the DeepCool Assassin III, and I absolutely needed to buy one of these and get it into the charts. Other than the raw size, what puts this cooler on the map against the best of the best are its 7 heat pipes, impeccably well-finished base, and of course, the 2 140mm fans. But either way, the Assassin isn't just designed to be one of the best air coolers around, but also one of the quietest relative to its cooling capacity. So when these 7 coolers are added to the already big list of higher-end air coolers that we've already tested, I think we have actually one of, if not the most comprehensive list of high-end air coolers that are being tested on a modern generation CPU socket. But the other thing I really needed to mention about some of these is the installation procedure, because while most of them are pretty straightforward, there are some challenges here and there. First of all, every single one of these has perfectly clear instructions, but I want to give a shout out to ID Cooling for including a color-coded instruction manual, and DeepCool for including a super nice screwdriver. Also, none of these has any type of nightmare installation procedure, thank God. The only challenge you might run into is with the Prosiphon. It's huge, heavy, and pretty unwieldy when installing. Plus, you'll need to contact IceGiant if you're rocking an LGA 1700 socket, since the original cooler didn't come with the necessary brackets. There is, however, one final thing that I want to get into before heading into the benchmarks, and that is some of the challenges some of these coolers have when it comes to performance on the LGA 1700 socket. And this is probably going to answer a lot of your questions as to why there might be such a big discrepancy between our old test system and this new one. A lot of the high-end coolers on the market right now were created for a very different generation of processors. Ones with larger, less condensed dies like the earlier Ryzen and Intel CPUs, but overlay a 13th gen CPU onto the coolers that have a large number of heat pipes spread across a larger base, and you can start to see the problem. On some, like the Thermalright Frost Commander, 2 of the massive heat pipes actually hang right off the IHS, meaning only 3 will be fully utilized. Others, like the Jonsbo and Montech, use a larger number of smaller diameter heat pipes spread over an even larger base, but the end result is the same off-die positioning. But like I said before, the IHS and the heatsink's base plate can only compensate for this so much. But there are some exceptions to that rule. The Frost Spirit has all its heat pipes locked and loaded right above the most critical area. And even the monster Assassin III and 207 XT use smaller heat pipes where even the outer ones still make partial contact. So anyways, when it comes to current generation CPUs like Intel's 13th gen and Ryzen 7000 series, what you might have to do is sort of withdraw yourself a little bit from the typical heatsink marketing that always seems to say heatsink size and a massive number of heat pipes are the best way to go. That might not actually be the most efficient way to cool modern CPUs. So you need to keep that in mind as we go through the results in this video. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's talk about how we actually tested these heatsinks and previous ones. First of all, we're using a 13900K at a couple of different TDP settings. First, there's a setting of 180 watts that's meant to replicate a lower heat load of something like the 13600K or 13700. Next up is the 13900K operating at Intel's limits, which means a constant 253 watts. And finally, there's the chip running without any limits whatsoever at a constant 300 watts, or what some motherboards do in their default settings. That's what's also going to be used for the gaming load scenarios. So let's actually begin with gaming temperatures and add all the coolers that we've already tested. So the Dark Rock Pro 4, Noctua D15, U12A, Peerless Assassin, AK620, and Fuma 2. Starting with the Jonsbo and Montech, they actually get pretty similar results and narrowly beat the U12A. But don't take that as a compliment, guys. The U12A is a single tower heatsink, while these others are pretty large dual tower monsters by comparison. Actually, the triple fan approach on the Jonsbo means it can hit some amazingly low temperatures if you're willing to have it screaming away at over 45 decibels. But the Frost Commander and 207 XT are both able to beat it right across the board, on their way to even one-upping the Peerless Assassin above the 40 decibel mark. The Frost Spirit really blew me away though. It destroyed the Frost Commander, matching the Peerless Assassin at low noise levels, and then managed to pull comfortably ahead to the point where it ended up pretty much tied with the D15. Actually, the Assassin III was the only cooler here that managed to beat it. There's one cooler missing here though. And we actually need to expand this chart to fit the Prosiphon in because its temperature results are just horrendous. We're talking almost 20, yes, 20 degrees higher than the best coolers here, despite it being the most expensive. The main reason is because it ends up chowing down on most of the heat our RTX 3090s dumping into the case. So instead of it being parallel to the case's natural airflow, it's perpendicular, and that just plays havoc with its access to fresh air. Even narrowing that down to 38 decibels doesn't do much in the Prosiphon's favor, and even without focusing just on that one, there's a massive difference between the best and the worst coolers here. Now before you say, oh my god, this is bad for the IceGiant, its temperatures mean absolutely nothing when it comes to actual gaming performance. It doesn't matter if the CPU is running north of 80 degrees or under 70. Every one of the coolers here gets identical frame rates, or at least identical when we factor margin of error into account. And now what this really does show is how little temperatures matter when it comes to providing optimal frame rates on Intel's 13th gen. I mean, the CPUs are literally designed for that. I already covered that in a bunch of videos. So with that established, let's go on to the next step, which is full load testing. Let's start out with the lowest 180 watt thermal output with those originally tested coolers, which go here. Now for the ones in this video, starting with the Montech DT24, which is pretty competitive against the Fuma 2 and U12A, but ultimately ends up getting beat by both of those coolers across the entire decibel range. Meanwhile, the 207 XT starts off pretty poorly, but then it picks things up in a big way by getting pretty close to the Dark Rock Pro 4. It does get pretty loud though, but that also gives it an extra gear in cooling. Then there's a Frost Commander and Jonsbo HX7280, which literally run neck and neck and get some of the best results as decibel levels rise. Considering the 7280 is running with 3 fans here, well, that does go to show you how good the Thermalright's dual setup really is. The Assassin III though, that should surprise literally no one. It's the best of the best, consistently beating the D15 by about 1 to 2 degrees. And yet there are 2 surprises here, one of which is the Prosiphon that barely matched the U12A eventually. The Thermalright FS140 meanwhile gets ridiculously good results. It basically matches the Assassin III and just embarrasses the more expensive FC142. And you can really see that difference when narrowing things down to a constant decibel level. There's a huge 8 to 10 degree difference between the Prosiphon and DT24 versus the Frost Spirit and Assassin III. Meanwhile, the rest of the coolers are somewhere in between those. That's bad news for more expensive options like the Jonsbo and Frost Commander, but good news for the 207 XT that pulls off respectable performance given its price and compact size. But switch over to frequencies and adding our existing results, well, things start to get really interesting. That's because the Jonsbo, ID Cooling, and FC140 all get literally identical results, as do most of the other coolers. The IceGiant and Montech, on the other hand, end up trailing the pack, while the Assassin III is right up there, tied with the D15 and Peerless Assassin. But even though the Frost Spirit was tied from a temperature perspective with the Assassin, it was actually able to give the CPU a bit more thermal headroom so it could boost a little bit higher. And yet you have to put this into perspective too, because the delta between the worst cooler here running at 36 decibels and the Spirit's very best result is just about 50 megahertz. That really comes into perspective when we dive down into a constant 38 decibel range, where honestly, you aren't really gaining or losing much actual performance regardless of the CPU cooler you end up choosing. Stepping things up to 253 watts or Intel's limits, pretty much every single cooler struggles to get under 90 degrees here, with some pegged at the TJ max point of 100 degrees too. Either way, the DT24 didn't do too badly here by consistently beating the Fuma and Dark Rock, while the 207 XT pulled its butt out of the fire beyond 39 decibels, where it was just narrowly beaten by the Prosiphon of all things. Meanwhile, the huge Jonsbo and Frost Commander ended up being neck and neck for the first third of their RPM ranges, but then the HX7280 ended up winning by a narrow margin. The best, well, they stayed the best, with the Frost Spirit essentially matching the D15 and getting better results than the Peerless Assassin. Meanwhile, the DeepCool Assassin III started off a bit behind, but then pulled off the lowest temperatures here if you're willing to put up with a bit more noise. Let's put this into a little bit more clear to understand graph, because this shows there's a pretty clear gap between the best coolers here and everything else. And yet nothing, and I mean nothing, ends up breaking the 90-degree mark. And switching over to clock speeds, you can see that the 207 XT, Prosiphon, and DT24 are far from getting the best temperatures, but as decibel levels increase, the 13900K's clock speeds aren't that bad at all in these coolers. The same goes for the Jonsbo and FC140, since both struggle a bit at low noise, but they eventually give the highest performance here, topping out around 5.75 gigahertz on the P cores. The word for consistency though, well, that goes to the FS140 and especially the Assassin III, since they allow the CPU to hit its maximum performance from almost the 36 decibel jump off point. If you care about getting the best performance coupled with the lowest noise levels, then the Frost Spirit, D15, Assassin III, and Peerless Assassin should obviously be your go-tos. Others can be more than 150 megahertz behind in an all-core workload here. Anyways, the last stop here is of course running a 13900K with absolutely no limits whatsoever. And yes, I know this is going to be a foregone conclusion for a lot of you guys, but maybe not, because there are some really interesting things going on here. Because every cooler here, yes, even the Prosiphon Elite, smashes right into Intel's TJ max limit all day, every day, because clock speeds do end up varying wildly regardless of the temperatures. The last round of coolers ranged from about 5 gigahertz on the low end to 5.36 or so on the Peerless Assassin. Unfortunately, the 207 XT and DT24 get completely overwhelmed here, and the same thing goes for the IceGiant, though it actually gets a hell of a lot better above the 40 decibel mark. Moving up from that, the FC140 and Jonsbo are literal carbon copies of one another, and both ended up topping out around 5.37 gigahertz, which is the highest we've seen so far. And get this, they're still outdone by the Assassin III and Frost Spirit, since both those coolers can get much better results at lower noise levels. But it essentially becomes a four-way tie here, with the Peerless Assassin and D15 at this level too. So I guess it's time to wrap this up, and I wanted to address two of the sort of WTF moments right off the bat before you guys start sort of like angrily typing away on those keyboards. And that is the performance, or rather like the lack thereof, of two coolers. That would be the Prosiphon Elite and the Frost Commander. I wanted to start with the IceGiant first because I had a long series of conversations with the engineers over at IceGiant, and they explained a couple of things to me about this thing. This cooler was simply designed from the ground up for processors with larger package designs, like older Ryzen's Threadrippers, or Intel's HEDT series. Due to a number of design decisions, including an aluminum rather than copper base plate, it will naturally struggle with the smaller, tightly condensed packages of current desktop CPUs like the 13900K we're testing with here. This doesn't mean the Prosiphon is a bad cooler whatsoever, because it's proven it has amazing potential, just not on the platform we're testing with here. As for the Frost Commander, that had us going around and around, to the point, check this out, I actually bought 2 more of these coolers in order to validate our results, because on paper at least, this cooler should be mopping the floor with something like the FS140, but it actually didn't. There's just no way to tell exactly what's going on here, but fingers can certainly be pointed at its base plate configuration, where using too many massive heat pipes actually leads to less efficient heat transfer than the 4 strategically placed ones on the Spirit. Meanwhile, some of the other coolers are all over the place. The Jonsbo HX7280 has the chops to be one of the best coolers on the planet, but it isn't great at lower noise levels. The Montech DT24 on the other hand, well, it's not really anything special unless it's a lot cheaper in your region than it is here in North America. The Assassin III, that proved itself to be one of the best coolers on the planet, so it makes me super excited for what the 4th generation model will offer. And the 207 XT might have been outclassed by bigger, more expensive coolers, but if you're in a region that doesn't have access to some of the top tier picks here, it's a solid price to performance choice for a gaming system. The one cooler here though that really stood out as super impressive compared to everything else that I've tested to date is, of course, guess what? The Frost Spirit, or FS140, because it is basically the full package. You get performance, you get a price that might be a little bit above the Peerless Assassin. It has easy installation, and in a lot of regions, it is very much widely available at some very, very fair prices. And speaking of price, if you play your cards right, especially here in North America, sometimes you can find this cooler for less than the Peerless Assassin. And for that, guess what? Another Thermalright product is getting it, both the Damn Good Award and the Damn Good Value Award. And I guess in the end, what this does is it sets the stage for high-end air cooling reviews here on Hardware Canucks in 2023 and into 2024, because in the next year or so, we are going to be seeing some amazing competitors being launched. There's the Assassin 4 and supposedly a new Noctua D15 and a bunch of other ones. What this does is it makes me really excited for what's coming up and to see how those compare to what we currently have. So anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I will definitely see you in the next one. Take care, guys.